Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Alright, let's slow this down for a minute. Because what just happened with Trump's tariff policy and the Supreme Court is not just about tariffs. It's not just about trade. And it's definitely not just about whether a 15% baseline tax on imports survives or not. What we're actually watching here is something much bigger. We're watching the boundaries of presidential power being tested again, and this time, it's in the arena of economic emergency authority. Now on the surface, the headline sounds dramatic. The Supreme Court rules against Trump's global tariff approach. Some media outlets immediately frame it as a major blow. Others say it's symbolic and doesn't really change much because Trump still has other legal tools. And then you have commentators arguing that this might even strengthen presidential authority in the long run. But I think all of that misses the deeper issue. The real story is not whether Trump can still impose tariffs using Section 301, or Section 232, or Section 122, or any other statutory mechanism. The real story is this: how far can a president stretch emergency economic powers before the judiciary steps in? Because this case centers on the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. That law was originally designed during the Cold War era. It was meant to give presidents the ability to respond quickly to national emergencies, sanctions, asset freezes, restrictions on hostile actors. It was not originally designed as a broad trade policy instrument. Over time, however, the definition of national emergency has expanded. Presidents from both parties have declared emergencies for all kinds of reasons. And once you declare an emergency, you unlock a whole set of executive tools. Trump's approach to tariffs often relied on this emergency framing. The argument was essentially this: trade imbalances, unfair practices, supply chain vulnerabilities. These constitute threats to national security or economic stability. Therefore, emergency authority applies. Now, here's where the institutional tension comes in. Congress technically holds the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. That's in the Constitution. But over decades, Congress has delegated significant authority to the executive branch through trade statutes. Why? Because trade policy requires speed, negotiation flexibility, and strategic leverage. So we've ended up with a hybrid system. Congress writes broad frameworks. Presidents implement them with wide discretion. The question this Supreme Court ruling raises is whether that discretion has limits when it comes to emergency-based tariffs. Some analysts are saying, relax, the president still has Section 301. And they're not wrong. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 gives the executive branch substantial authority to respond to unfair trade practices. That's what Trump used extensively against China during his first term. It allows unilateral tariffs after an investigation. It doesn't require an emergency declaration in the same way. Then there's Section 232, which is based on national security threats tied to specific imports like steel or aluminum. That one requires a Commerce Department investigation. It's slower, more procedural. Section 122 allows temporary tariffs to address serious balance of payments deficits, but only for a limited period, unless Congress extends it. Section 201 focuses on industry safeguard measures after injury determinations. So yes, legally speaking, the toolbox is still there. But here's the institutional nuance. Emergency authority is fundamentally different from delegated trade authority. Emergency authority is fast, it's unilateral, it's politically explosive. It signals crisis. And most importantly, it bypasses layers of procedural friction. Delegated trade statutes, by contrast, require investigations, reports, consultations, comment periods. They introduce time delays and litigation risk. So when the court steps in and says effectively, you cannot use emergency powers this broadly for tariff policy. That's not just about this specific tariff. That's about drawing a line around the emergency doctrine itself. And that matters, because over the past 2 decades, we've seen a steady expansion of executive power in both security and economic domains. After 9/11, emergency powers became normalized. Financial crises introduced new executive interventions. Pandemic policy further expanded federal reach. Each crisis leaves behind structural precedents. The Supreme Court's involvement here suggests something important. At least some justices are concerned about emergency power becoming a routine policy shortcut. That's the deeper tension. Now let's address the political angle, because you can't separate this from politics. Trump's economic strategy has always been rooted in disruption. Tariffs are not just revenue tools for him, they're leverage devices, they're negotiation pressure points, they're campaign messaging. If emergency-based tariffs are constrained, does that weaken him politically? Not necessarily. He can pivot. He can use other statutes. He can frame the court's decision as obstruction. He can rally supporters around the idea that entrenched institutions are limiting executive action. But the fact that the court is willing to scrutinize this authority introduces a new variable into future policymaking. Markets care about predictability. Businesses care about procedural clarity. Investors price in risk based on whether policies can survive judicial review. When emergency power becomes judicially contested, uncertainty increases. That's the part that doesn't show up in a simple "tariff survive" headline. There's also a structural question here about Congress itself. For decades, Congress has been reluctant to reclaim trade authority. Members often prefer to criticize executive action after the fact rather than legislate clear boundaries beforehand. Delegation is politically convenient. But when courts start narrowing executive interpretations, it forces Congress into a more active role, at least in theory. Will Congress step up and redefine trade authority? That's unclear, but the judiciary's involvement shifts the balance. This isn't just about Trump. Imagine a future Democratic president using emergency economic authority to impose climate-related trade restrictions or supply chain tariffs tied to labor standards. The precedent set now will shape those possibilities. That's why institutional conservatives and institutional liberals both care about this case, even if they disagree on Trump specifically. Now, there's another subtle dynamic here. When presidents rely heavily on emergency framing, they implicitly elevate economic competition to the level of national security threat. That changes the tone of global trade. It transforms policy disputes into security confrontations. If courts limit that framing, it might lower the temperature of economic statecraft, or it might push presidents to repackage the same policies under different legal theories. But either way, the judiciary is signaling emergency authority is not a blank check. And historically, the Supreme Court has oscillated on executive power. In times of war or crisis, it often defers. In periods of institutional recalibration, it reasserts boundaries. Think about the steel seizure case in 1952 under President Truman. The court ruled that executive emergency power has limits. Even during wartime, that case still shapes constitutional interpretation today. We may look back on this tariff ruling in a similar light, not because of the tariff rate itself, but because of what it says about separation of powers. There's also the messaging battle. Some commentators argue that the decision actually clarifies presidential authority by distinguishing between emergency statutes and traditional trade laws. In that sense, they say, it strengthens executive trade power by forcing it into clearer channels. There's some truth to that. Clarity can be empowering, but clarity also creates accountability. When you can't declare a sweeping emergency and move instantly, you have to justify your policy through established processes. That means evidence reports, investigations, and processes can slow momentum. So if you zoom out, this isn't a simple win or loss. It's an institutional negotiation. The executive branch pushes its interpretation to the edge. The judiciary evaluates. The boundary adjusts. That's how constitutional systems evolve, not through dramatic rewrites, but through incremental cases. Now, let's talk about the future. Will this decision significantly alter U.S. trade policy? Probably not in the immediate term. Presidents still have substantial leverage. The political appetite for strategic tariffs remains strong across both parties, but but it does mean that future administrations may think twice before leaning on emergency declarations as their first resort. And that's significant, because once emergency authority becomes routine, the definition of emergency dissolves. Everything becomes urgent, everything becomes exceptional, and in that environment, normal legislative processes erode. From a democratic stability perspective, maintaining a distinction between crisis response and standard policymaking is crucial. So when you hear people argue that this ruling changes nothing, I think that's too shallow. And when you hear others claim it destroys executive trade strategy, that's also overstated. The real impact lies in signaling. The court is saying, we are watching the boundaries of economic emergency power, and in a polarized era, that message resonates beyond tariffs. One final thought. In highly partisan environments, institutional debates often get reduced to personality battles. It becomes, is this pro-Trump or anti-Trump? But that framing hides the structural dimension. What's actually happening here is the constitutional system absorbing pressure. Executive ambition meets judicial review. Legislative delegation meets interpretive limits. This is not dysfunction. This is friction. And friction, in a constitutional republic, is sometimes the safeguard. So if you're trying to understand this story, don't focus only on whether a 15% tariff survives next month. Focus on whether emergency economic power just became a little less elastic. Because if that's true, then this case may matter far more than any single trade policy. And in the long arc of American governance, that's where the real story is unfolding. Thanks for watching.